Hi guys, it's Luetin and Daskro here, back again for another discussion, and we're back on a bit of kind of real talking topics today. We've talked before about gun legislation in the US. Now, there's been a little bit of time since me and Daskro discussed this. I think some people were kind of surprised at my opinions last time because a lot of people had seen some tweets and just general kind of political notes that I put out there, and I think everyone expected me, especially because I'm in the UK, to be highly anti-gun and all these kind of things. But, you know, actually, I tend to kind of have a more balanced opinion about it all. And as I've said in the last video, I'll link it below as well. If people didn't see that, you want to go watch that first before watching this one. But, you know, my general kind of opinion is that it's a very, very cultural thing in the US. Obviously, over here in the UK, we don't really have that same kind of sort of system and setup. And so just as well, the general quantity of weapons is just not here in the UK. So it's a very, very different perspective. But the reason we're talking about this today, the time since we talked about the last one, there's been a lot of changes and a lot of sort of events, as I would say, actually happening. So I think it's a kind of good time to kind of revisit this topic, just think a little bit about some of those things. I mean, Daskro, we've talked about this kind of off, recording before. But what was one of the last topics that we sort of mentioned before that's happened since we last discussed that was particularly interesting to you? I think obviously the kind of the sort of the votes and stuff that were put forward in the US in the Senate, and obviously got changed around because of the NRA, etc., etc. Now, you and me talked a little bit about that before. Do you want to sort of just overview that and kind of what we were thinking around that? Because we talked about it before, but just give people a little maybe heads up there.
I think that to people who don't follow Second Amendment issues generally, whether they're in pro Second Amendment or are in favor of gun control, a lot of people were very surprised by some of the outcomes that have taken place in the last 5 months or so. There was a big push for changes in how the gun laws operated in the U.S. A lot of different bills were passed around, and people were very surprised by how nothing happened. How that even some of the Senate bills that were very moderate in nature, or at least in the eyes of the press, even those didn't even get an up or down vote. They were filibustered or threat of filibustered in this case. In this respect, there is a lot of...
Could you just clarify for people not in the US what that is? Because I think some people may not know.
Sure. And so there were a number of bills that were presented in the legislature from January all the way to, April when the last one hit. And the one that had the most chance of getting to a vote in the Senate, and take in mind that once the vote in the Senate takes place, it has to be voted then in the House in order to become a law, and signed by the president, of course. And this Senate bill required, amongst other things, more extensive background checks, trying to eliminate the so-called gun show loophole, the online sales loophole, and a slew of other different of items that were to try to reduce the different avenues where people can acquire weapons without having to go through a federal background check. And even this bill, which was very, very watered down relative to how it started and had some support with some Republicans, didn't even get an up or down vote. They couldn't muster the 60 votes needed to stop a filibuster, and as such, it never got an up or down vote, and it died in committee, and now it's no longer even in the conversation.
No, it's just dead in the water.
And many people, and just from additional context, were flabbergasted by the outcome of this, because surely over the last 9 months, as we have seen shootings in Aurora and shootings in Sandy Hook, that most certainly the legislature and the constituency that they're supposed to represent would have done something about this. And there's a lot of disbelief as to what happened, why it happened, and in some cases, a lot of people are very angry about it.
Yeah, and before I go on and just make my next point, I will say some people are going to say, Luetin, why are you interested in this? You live in the UK, but I'm generally interested in kind of world politics, world events, cultural stuff. So I listen to a lot of things, news around the world and stuff. So, but this is a kind of particularly interesting topic for me because it's kind of, it's a social aspect, it's a cultural aspect. There's a lot to it, and it's quite a complex topic. So that's one reason why I'm particularly sort of interested in this as well. But this whole issue of it being, filibustered and taken out, and as it was so watered down, and then they just killed it anyway. And I remember I said to you at the time that I wondered whether the NRA had really kind of, it was obvious that they put so much pressure. And the fact was that this bill anyway, it wouldn't have really done much at the state it was in at the end. And I remember what I said to you was that maybe they had kind of really overstated their hand, and it would piss off a lot of people that they didn't even put this in place. And, could that have consequences for them later on with the kind of wrath of the people? They try to do something later which would make more of a significant difference, and they try to do something again, and whether people would react to that in a particularly negative way, I don't know. But it's an interesting thing to think about there. But, something else that I mentioned before to you was that this bill, it would have made some changes, but, I said I realistically don't think it would really do anything. I mean, background checks for people, yeah, sure, it's a decent thing to have. It's not a bad thing to have, but I don't think it's going to solve any problems whatsoever, because that is not the issue. The issue is people who are perhaps unstable or have, particularly vicious intention, taking weapons and using them. Now, people have stupidly said, oh, well, in that case, the only way we can solve this problem is to get rid of the guns. Just, get your feet on the ground. That's not going to happen. And so therefore you have to start thinking about other things. Now, I'm sorry, I cannot remember her name, but there was a US senator, wasn't there? And she got a lot of flack because she voted against that bill. And then she went on to sort of make statements saying about mental health. Do you remember who that was? Okay, me and Daskro just looked it up, and it's the senator. I think she's Kelly Ayotte or Kelly Ayotte. We're not sure how to pronounce it, but anyway, yeah, she got a lot of flack, and she made this statement saying about, okay, the reason I didn't vote for this is because I think it wouldn't solve the problem, and the actual issue that would be much more beneficial is mental health. And I totally agree. Having extra background checks would not have solved any of the most recent problems that there have been. The reason that these people, the general reason these people committed these crimes is because there were weapons in their vicinity that they could easily get hold of that weren't even their sort of property. So, for example, in the Sandy Hook case, I believe he got his mother's weapons or something, I think it was. And, obviously they would have done background checks on her. So if she had had a completely clean slate, she would have been able to have those weapons. And then he still would have been able to do it. So it wouldn't have solved anything. It would have still happened. But people made the comment that he had a lot of, if you listen to the stories and you actually looked into it, he had mental health problems. He'd had a lot of depression, I believe. He'd had real issues there. But I think his family weren't, sort of doing the best that they could. And I expect, within that kind of context, they probably wouldn't have been able to afford to get the help they needed for him. And that really is the issue there, is this thing of getting help. Now, obviously, in every single, that's not going to work in every situation. But I think it's an interesting point to look at, that in a lot of these recent cases, the people involved seem to have had some kind of problem. And I think personally that dealing with that in a kind of more social aspect, getting people in the community involved, saying, okay, this guy, we know him, blah, blah, blah. A lot of the time people know these people. They have had interactions with them. They actually know that they maybe have an unstable personality, or they just got general life problems that anybody can have, and they need some help. And, that's something where I talk about the difference between, for example, in the EU and the US, where in a lot of the countries in the EU, they have kind of socialized healthcare, where you don't have to pay. For example, in the UK, if you're suffering from these kind of problems, if you have sort of social health problems, you've got depression, you've got really, really bad things, maybe you go for a terrible time in your life, you can go to the doctor, you don't have to pay, and you just say, okay, I need to speak to somebody, etc. They can get you in touch. Or a family member who needs some help, and maybe they don't want to come forward themselves, but their family can say, okay, he needs some help, and with their permission, obviously they get to speak to somebody. But when you don't have that system in place, that you can't get that care, you can't get that help. And then obviously the problem can just spiral and spiral out of control. Now, for most people, it won't lead to a terrible event, a terrible sort of tragedy. Most of the times it would just be a tragedy for that individual. Their life would perhaps fall apart. But in extreme cases, it will lead to something like this. However, all of this legislation, all these bills that they've been putting forward would not have stopped, would not have solved the problem. And I think that's a really kind of interesting key point. Do you agree, Daskro? Do you think there'd be any other way of looking at these things?
Well, it is an interesting point, and it actually brings up a series of laws that do exist in the United States that are very contentious, and that is how do you made a comment about how that a lot of people locally may identify some of these people or identify that they may have certain issues at play, be it they have mental health issues or they have tendencies of violence or whatever it may be. One of the ways that historically this has been dealt with is how do you create a local function in order to try to get that level of understanding for that person that may want to have a weapon. And what has been done in the past was some kind of requirement of a local law enforcement sign-up. Now, that's what the idea of using it today it stands. And so if I want to get a machine gun, I have to go to my sheriff and have him sign a form, which he will not sign if he thinks that I'm a criminal or crazy. And then I use that form, show it to the federal government, who then say, oh, your sheriff signs up. And you're good to go. In New Jersey, it's actually a lot more arduous. You don't have to get a local law enforcement sign up. You actually have to get several letters of good character, friends and relatives and things like that.
See, these things are in place. This is the point. I mean, we mentioned this on the last video that often the loops that people have to jump through already, they're often actually more stringent than some people might imagine. Not for every class or specific of weapon, but there are things in place there. And so it's not a free fall like some people imagine.
No, it's certainly different from state to state. Now, I worded this very carefully because the origins of these laws had nothing to do with the sheriff saying you are of good moral character in that are you violent or crazy. It was more on the lines of the sheriff identifying whether you were white or black, because these were Jim Crow era laws and they didn't want minorities to have weapons at the time, and that was a way of stopping it. Because if you're a black person, you got a white name, the federal government doesn't know if you're black or white or not. And again, I'm not saying the U.S. government is racist currently, but again, going back to how these laws got formed, these reasons
in the
why.
past it would have been a lot more.
But to your point, Connecticut, in which Sandy Hook took place, already had an assault weapons ban. They already had gun registration. They already had gun licensing.
Exactly. Yeah.
They had a waiting period. They had all the sort of the litany of traditional things that the gun control movement has been pushing for years. And take in mind, I mean, not to get too technical in here, but I mean, sadly, the perpetrator of this act used what many have called an assault rifle, but it really wasn't an assault rifle because assault rifles are banned in Connecticut. It was a rifle that was compliant with the laws that in place in Connecticut, and yet they still existed there. And that's because assault weapons as a concept are a sham, and that you can make them compliant by taking out the barrel shroud and taking off the bayonet lug and taking off the pistol grip and things like that. The gun functionally works identical to any other hunting rifle, and as such, the absurdity of these laws present themselves quite clearly when we have these rare tragedies and find that the efficacy is not there.
I think the thing as well that I've said before is that often with a lot of crimes and these kind of things, whether it be a gun crime or any kind of crime, if somebody has the will, if somebody has the presence of mind, the will to do something like this, they're going to do it one way or another. You know, if somebody's got the strength in their mind, I use that word strength not in a kind of positive way. I mean, in more, they actually have, like most people couldn't imagine actually being able to physically do something like this. So you have to be of a certain mentality where you've either snapped and your mind is actually gone, or you are so dedicated in a kind of perhaps more an extremist terrorist sense, that you actually have that level of willpower when you sort of think of like perhaps suicide bombers, etc. People like that who have got that kind of, I don't want to use the word clarity of mind, but that kind of thing where literally they're so focused on it that that's where they're coming from. So with keeping that in mind, like you say, the state where they committed this crime and so on, they already had all of this stuff in place, and he still managed to do it. He still managed to get hold of it. And I guess that's really the point, is that even though it kind of proves it, that even though they already had all of this stuff in place, and it didn't matter because he was so determined, and so, he'd obviously lost it in his mind. He was so psyched and just kind of crazy, this guy, his life or whatever, his mind had fallen apart. Yeah, okay, he was able to secure a weapon in his own home. But I would maintain that somebody that has lost that level of mentality, they're going to be able to do it one way or another, be it a gun or a knife or whatever, they're going to commit these crimes. I guess the only point that people make is they say, about, okay, but because they have semi-auto rifles and the amount of ammunition they can carry, etc., etc. This is true, but like Daskro has just said, they already had all the laws that you would expect to be in place for this, and he still committed it. So, what do you want? It just kind of proves that over legislate. Literally, unless you're literally going to take people's guns away, what are you going to do? It's a very, very difficult one.
No doubt. And going back to where a lot of the sort of outrage over the outcome in the end for this particular bill, and for how that no gun laws were passed in the last 6 months, there was a lot of talk about how that one, you had the gun manufacturers throwing a lot of money at it to the NRA, and that also a lot of polls came out saying that a vast majority of people were wanted changes in the gun laws, and people were touting these facts consistently to show that, hey, these legislators that are voting against these bills, they are betraying their constituents, because most people want them. But I think one thing that has to be taken in mind is, and I'm going to loosely quote John Stuart Mills here, the interest, the determination and passion of one is equal to that of 100 with just interest. And I'm paraphrasing here. The reason why I'm bringing this quote up is that there actually are a pretty small minority of gun owners. But if you were to rank Second Amendment issues for these people on what am I going to vote on in terms of how I cast my vote, how much time I dedicate for the cause, how much money I will donate to these various groups, it's number one on these people's list. Whereas with gun control and gun rights more generally, most people, it's ranked somewhere below tax reform and tort reform. It's so conceptual, and unless you are personally affected by any kind of violence for that matter, which most people aren't, even though that we have we have high murder rates here in the U.S. relative to some European countries, it's still pretty low. And and from a demographic perspective, it actually disproportionately impacts only certain communities. When you take those very small communities out of the mix, we're actually closer in sync to the murder rates to other countries out there. But that's a side point. Yeah. My point behind this is that while a vast majority of people, want to see gun control reform, in the same respect that a lot of people want to make sure that rapists never, get out in the streets, or that murderers don't keep on murdering. These are sort of I agree with that. Of course, I don't want more rapists on the street, and yet the actual passion behind it, the actual interest in it, or understanding the issues really aren't there. And so when these gun issues come into mind, and I'm by far not equating gun rights with rape or anything around those lines. It's probably a bad example.
It was a bad example.
But the point is that when these gun issues come into the fold, you have a minority of people, small minority of people, that are gun owners, but they're super passionate about it. They're willing to dedicate their time and resources and effort to make sure that their congresspeople are known. And I will tell you, and I'm friends with a lot of gun owners that are this passionate, they are writing their congressmen and calling their congresspeople every day. Not even kidding, every day. And they let their opinions known. And even though that there may be 100 times more people out there that have an opinion on the issue, just an opinion on the issue, those 100 people are not going to be calling their congresspeople. They're not going to be protesting. They're not going to be donating their money to various political action groups in order to solicit a change. Because while it's an issue that they have an opinion of, it's not that big of a deal for a vast majority of people. And the way our democracy works and how good democracies operate is that it's not just the will of the people based on what they feel like a law should be like. Instead, there has to be a component of being able to showcase that for some people it is the issue, and they are going to fight tooth and nail for it. No different than the individuals who support equal rights among gay, lesbian, bisexuals, and LGBT movement, or by those that support immigration reform, or those that support civil rights. If you ask someone, they may have an opinion of whether gays should marry or not. But are they going to have the same kind of? Are they going to dedicate the same amount of effort to that opinion versus someone who lives in a gay community, and it's a big issue because they don't have these fundamental rights that a lot of people take for granted, that kind of thing. That's the kind of thing we have to think about, and the polls show it. A recent Gallup poll said that only 4% of the population care about gun issues as one of their top 10 priorities out there. And so it's not that big of a population, so but most people just don't care about it.
I think, from my perspective, and like we've spoken about as well, from my point of view, I just feel like there's a compromise to be had, but a compromise that allows people to do what they want to do, but just moves in the right direction. Now, one of those things, as I've mentioned about, is healthcare and just that kind of social issue. All right, that's one thing, because we spoke about this before on the last video, and I think I remember back then saying that I really believe this was more of a social issue rather than a legislation issue. The fact that it's a cultural thing, and we talked about this, that the US has had a lot of guns for a long time. It's part of your culture over there, and it's just something that always has been there, and it's written into your constitution. And I think that's something that, again, people from outside the US don't always kind of grasp just how ingrained some of these things are. And so this, when people say, well, the only solution is to get rid of guns, like I say, that's a non-starter. So it's not even worth discussing. All right, so you have to look at other things. Now, for me, I think something that I said to you before was this, about, more stricter rules about actually how you keep and handle things, be more responsible, because I think that goes a long way towards perhaps preventing and solving some of these problems. Now, obviously, you're not going to be able to solve crime in that way, but it would perhaps move in the right direction to preventing, less accidental deaths and less of these issues where, a family member picks up a weapon that just happens to be lying around the home. Again, I think in the case of the Sandy Hook deal, she had some weapons, but they weren't secured, they weren't locked away, they were just there in the house, and he was able to just pick them up. And if she had been a responsible owner, if she'd have had some kind of a box or lockbox or whatever, somewhere that she could lock them securely away. And as I've mentioned, in the UK, that is the law, that if you own a shotgun or rifle, it has to be kept in a secured metal box, which I believe is concreted into the ground and permanently locked. And then the police will come regularly to check that and ensure that you're keeping it responsibly. They'll just come around, randomly at any time and say, we want to inspect, and you have to allow them to inspect. And you have to have, obviously, all the correct paperwork, etc. as well. But you see, I don't understand why that's something that couldn't be put in place. You're not actually preventing anyone from owning what they want to own. All you're saying is, we're happy for you to have this stuff, but you just have to have it in a secured way. Now, I do remember that you made the point of in a home defense situation, which is obviously sometimes what these, the reason why people have weapons, pistols, as well as, shotguns, rifles, whatever. You said to me about, okay, but how's that going to work if somebody has a weapon by their bedside? And it's kind of like, yeah, that is a fair point. I can understand that, that's one of the reasons why people want to have weapons in their home. But on the other hand, we're not talking about pistols here. We're talking about sort of other weapons, rifles, assault rifles, or whatever you want, semi-automatic rifles. Do you think there's a compromise to be had there? Do you think people would accept it? I mean, from my point of view, as I say, I just feel like it would be a compromise, a step in the right direction, and you wouldn't be preventing people from owning it. I think actually another point that I mentioned before to you was about just making it kind of socially unacceptable to be, to not be a responsible weapon. Didn't you say this about going to the range or something, and how they were trying to encourage people to be more responsible generally in just their handling of things and stuff like that?
Yeah, that is one of the issues. There is a certain amount of self-regulation that does have to take place, because there are irresponsible gun owners out there. Can
I just hop in? Sorry, just hop in with one specific point there as well. There was obviously the appallingly tragic case of that little boy who I believe was 5 and shot his sister, was 2, with the whole My First Rifle deal.
Yes.
And again, and we mentioned that as well. And I just want to mention this, guys, because it's relevant to the whole responsible owners. Now, okay, some people are going to have the debate about should a child that young have a weapon, etc. That's a conversation to be had about what age is appropriate, etc., etc. However, I believe under supervision, etc. I remember when I was young, and this is in the UK, we went out hunting and stuff with rifle, even in the UK. Okay, so it's not something I did all the time. It was a friend that I went with, etc., etc. But we went out and did some hunting out there because I lived in the country when I was younger. However, anyway, the point being. It was really appalling, and obviously that boy, as I say, there's conversation of whether or not he should have been able to even have a gun at all. But the real issue was the fact that the family, the parents, left that weapon out. They left it out, loaded, and he was able to just pick it up. And obviously, so that was really the thing there for that, was that it was the irresponsibility that caused that problem. Now, obviously, you want to be sympathetic, and you don't want to sort of just blame. But within a wider context, it does sort of make the point of responsibility that, if you take these things away and you put them and you secure them safely, these accidents, these kind of terrible tragedies, the reason I say that obviously was not an accident, but, there are times when weapons just randomly go off or people put them down, etc., etc. That's an accident. So it just goes into that idea of responsibility,
I mean, I think that gun owners are their own worst enemy in this respect because for every 100 gun owners or 1,000 gun owners that are responsible, you may have a few that are not. And I'm not trying to say that gun owners are being negligent here. It's very much saying car owners are negligent because some people drive drunk.
Yeah,
it's
so
not.
Much, yeah.
But just because there's only a few people that do it doesn't mean that if you're not at a bar and you see someone trying to get into a car,
yes,
that you take the prerogative to try to stop it,
yes,
to try to say, hey, buddy, we're all having fun, but you may put your this is actually not how a real conversation with someone would take place at all. But, I mean, hey, guy, I see that you are inebriated. I would like to take your keys. Not like that.
Less like that when it comes to weapon ownership.
It's like an after-school special, but you get the idea. It's gun owners have to self-regulate in that respect.
Definitely.
They have, if they're I've been at shooting ranges where there have been people there that have not been exercising good safety principles and putting other people at risk. Because I'll tell you that for some of these gun ranges, if they have an accident, they have someone that shoots himself, or worse, someone shooting someone else, the liability behind that can shut down the entire gun range. It's really quite bad. And you have all these safety procedures at these gun ranges, most gun ranges, because you don't want that to happen. But even those ranges in mind, the individuals still have to police other individuals and say, hey, guy, you can't be doing that.
I can imagine it must be so frustrating for somebody like yourself who, owns a lot of weapons, but then the frustration of, you going there to shoot or whatever you wanted to do for that day, you take something along, enjoy yourself, and, you have people come along who are like much more amateur, and they just don't have that kind of sensibility in place. And I guess what I would say is, do you think it should almost be a kind of what would be the word? I don't want to say law, but some kind of initiative to say, look, perhaps, what about this? If you want to drive a car, you have to take a test, etc., etc. If you want to own a gun, is there anything? I don't even know. Is there anything in place that says you have to learn before you can do it?
That is the closest thing you're going to come to that on a nationwide level is the fact that 48 states require some form of training for concealed carry, some more so than others. Although you bring up a very interesting point.
But when it comes to like rifles, shotguns, is there anything like that? Can you just literally go and pick one up with no kind of, other than background check? But that's not
for a vast majority.
That's not the same as handling, is it?
For a vast majority of states out there, the answer is there's no requirement. But I think you bring up a very interesting point. I have a coworker who lived in the UK for several years, working there, and he would often talk about his experience in attempting to get a British driver's license, and how he described it as completely different than what we experience here in the U.S., and how that it's actually very difficult and arduous and time-consuming to get a UK driver's license, and that the test is very rigorous. It's not like what we experience here in the U.S., where if you're not a retard, get it. And actually, there are plenty of no kidding. And I'm using.
Well, for one thing over there,
I should have used that word, but I will tell you that there are plenty of people who are mentally disabled who get driver's license when there's questions that they should have. They may not, be all there.
For one thing, in the US, obviously the driving license thing. You pretty much all drive automatic cars over there, whereas over here, pretty much all cars are manual. So there's another level of difficulty there in terms of learning to drive. But anyway, that's another issue there.
But the reason why I bring that up is that I think people would be appalled in the United States if you were to attempt to even implement half of the driving test requirements that the UK does. But I think that in doing that, you may actually be able to reduce some of the number of car accidents and things like that in here. Now, that's just one way of doing it, and I'm by no means advocating that we need to have a universal gun training course that everyone has to take, but I do like the fact that for operational use of firearms in public, which is to say concealed carry, there is training, and I do like the training. I've been through the training, and it's something that is good, but I don't know how it's good, but I don't know how the efficacy of how that training actually impacts.
See, this is what it's always. This is curious, because this is what it always comes back to, is the sort of efficacy, as you say, of it. Because there's this thing in the US of it's your right. Therefore,
no, I'm saying efficacy, not as in the ability for it to elicit the effect that we want to create.
Yes. Not ethics, yeah. But that's an easy one to get confused there when it basically sounds the same. Yeah, no, but all I was going to say was that obviously there is this thing of it's your right, and that's a very curious concept over here, because sure, we know our rights, etc., when it comes to certain laws and so on and so on, but for the most part in the UK, I don't know. I kind of myself have always felt like the government kind of decides what's going down, and we just kind of they change the rules. Like for example, with the fact that they outlaw pistols we mentioned before. That's you can't own pistols in the UK anymore, sidearms, and people just kind of went, oh well, the government's told us we can't do this anymore, so I guess we can't do it anymore. Whereas, in the US, you guys have a very different mentality of, it's written here, and therefore that's it. You can't change it. And when it comes to the kind of ownership thing, like we was talking about, that's why it's so difficult. And you say, this idea of we're going to make it so that people have to take a test, and if you got to the end of that test and they say, I'm sorry, you're not competent enough to actually own a weapon. Now, from my point of view, that's an amazing thing. That would be excellent. You say, look, you are absolutely entitled to have one, but only if you're not a total idiot and you're not going to just go around, accidentally shooting other people. Because to me, I can only sort of say, why would you not want that? It's not saying that you can't. It's just saying, you need to have a certain level of competency. But I take the point that because of the way the US Constitution is written and the way the rights and laws are over there, It's just probably realistically never going to happen. And that's why, yet again, you have to try and look at these other compromises, because it's just the way it is. And, there's no way of getting around it. You have to literally just look at other ways of doing it. And I think that's why it's a more interesting topic, because of the kind of pitfalls there are of, well, we can't change this. This is never going to work. This is never going to work. And you're left with this kind of patchwork of, right, so what can we actually do to kind of help alleviate some of this problem? That's what kind of interests me so much,
Well, I don't disagree. It's the ethical side of it is very interesting to think about, because of not just the constitutionality of it all, but also the culture that surrounds it. And in the case of the universal background checks question of that recent Senate bill, it really boiled back to that universal background checks question of by regulating all of these sales and forcing them to go through very specific channels, there is a fear that it will lead to an eventual gun registry. And even though that in that specific law that was in place that talked about how that there would not be a gun registry in place with this law, there was still the fear of it, and that may seem a bit irrational, especially to people
that harps back as well to a kind of wider fear, though, doesn't it? It's in some ways that's less to do with guns and more to do with the government owning people's sort of personal information, isn't it? The more the kind of they're keeping tabs on people. I think it's kind of that's really where that sort of lies, isn't it?
It is, and there is a concern in that respect. And even to take a more extreme example, you had mentioned that in the UK that they had recently, well, not recently, but they have outlawed pistols for the most part. With the recent news that Defense Distributed is now or was able to distribute, no pun intended, their 3D printer of the Liberator pistol, which is a fully functional pistol, and while that design was taken down, if you have those type of 3D printer, you could conceivably print that gun out in the UK, and if you could find the ammunition, or any ammunition for that matter, you now conceivably have a gun that is not registered and not regulated or anything else around those lines. Now, granted, a lot of people will say, "Well, hey, wait a minute, they used a $15,000 printer," but remember, guys, in the early 1980s, PCs were no kidding, $3,000 or $4,000 in 1980s dollars, which is to say nearly $10,000 in today's dollars.
That would have been like, if you look it up online, actually, you can find like hilarious adverts.
Oh yeah,
for sort of like a what is it, like a 10 meg hard drive or something. Oh
yeah. Nowadays, computers that have exponentially more power and capability, you can buy for less than $200, and it's insane to think about how much technology has progressed in that respect. And I don't think it's absurd of us to think that maybe in 15, 20 years from now, 3D printers will be a relatively cheap endeavor, and that the materials that they'll use will be a little bit more stronger than they are today. Yeah. And if that's the case, then suddenly any person that had a 3D printer, which they may be as prolific as iPhones, could potentially make a firearm. Yeah. That's sort of the issue behind a lot of this regulation, and one of the reasons why Defense Distributed is pursuing this is that they're putting the so what information is free and open, and if you want to do this, then you can do it, and it leads to a greater question of what happens if you can't regulate these things. What are other ways that you can do it? And I'll tell you that that it opens up a Pandora's box. And it brings a lot of these laws into question. Does it mean, in this hypothetical scenario I just painted, does this suddenly mean that the UK now has a tremendous amount of gun deaths because because they now have access to these 3D printed weapons? Or do they not actually have that much more gun deaths because because overall the issues of mental health and the issues of social economic disparity really aren't as bad as they used to be, and as such, people have a reason to kill each other.
Yeah,
some ideas to think about.
Yeah, it is, but we've talked a little bit more about the UK and the deal here, and I've mentioned before that people seem to have this idea, and I'm just mentioning this because maybe people didn't watch our video last time. People have this idea that in the UK you kind of just don't have guns. It's not true. You can have a gun, you can have a shotgun, a rifle, whatever you want. To be honest, I could probably go and get that process started tomorrow if I felt the need. But you need to have a legitimate reason for owning, i.e. Pest control, maybe you live on a farm or something like that, or you belong to an actual gun club. And there are gun clubs in the UK. It's just that for the most part, most people aren't interested in it. It's not one of those things. I don't know. And again, it really does come back to the cultural issue there. But something I hadn't really thought about before is this kind of issue of rights and where is appropriate for the government to step in and say, okay, we're going to do this. I mean, another thing is that in the UK, we don't have this whole lobby thing in the US, which I sometimes find kind of weird. I've got to say, I find it very strange that, these lobbies, basically people put money into lobbies or to lobby, send as individuals and say, hey, we're going to, we've got a lot of people putting pressure here for you to blah, 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 to do this. And we think that you should go this way, et cetera, et cetera. And, we've got lobbies with money and stuff. Sounds an awful lot like bribery to me. It's a very, very weird thing, and I've seen a lot of commentators just sort of online editorially mention this concept. I find it a very bizarre thing, and I cannot imagine it. I mean, in effect, it's like the more money you have, the more pressure you can put on people in the government to go more in line with what you're thinking, and it seems a very strange thing. But what that kind of leads me to is in the UK, we don't have that. But also the rights thing of sort of people being more accepting, perhaps, of the government's choices. We don't have the whole sort of, constitution over here in the UK. And so therefore, I mean, obviously everybody has human rights and blah, blah, blah. But, if the government turned around tomorrow and said, we're banning shotguns, now, there would probably be a bit of an outcry about it. Shotgun owners would be like, oh, this is an outrage. How are we going to do this now? Blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, people would just kind of accept it and go, well, government's decided, so, oh, well, guess we can't do that anymore. And
I mean, that's a very good point. And because there is not a large constituency of people that are into shooting sports. And as such, those laws can be amended and it doesn't impact people. Now, if at the same token, if they made some law about football games can't be played past 9:00 in the evening, it would be a huge uproar.
There would be a huge uproar. It's true. But do you know what's interesting is that? There would probably be a huge uproar, and it might be very, very damaging to that government. But I doubt that people would be so, outraged by it that they would reverse the decision.
Another idea to consider here is the idea of what Reddit was able to accomplish in recent years with Stop SOPA. You guys remember this? If you guys go on Reddit or are tech savvy, you knew that there were some bills in place that were going to change how we all digest information on the internet and how copyright's dealt with the internet. And a relatively small constituency of people actually got the legislature to not pass the bill. Enough people made phone calls. Enough people wrote their Congress people, and they were able to take away all this support for it. And take in mind, guys, I know that a lot of people on Reddit think that they're the center of the universe, that the Reddit's like the place to be. A majority of likely voters are not on Reddit. Just saying, guys. But there
was a recent one as well, wasn't there? Was it CESPA or CESCA or something?
Yeah, CESPA was a part of this. But take in mind, guys, that even though that those folks were a small minority of the voting bloc, they were able to elicit change. And you get enough people that are angry enough, and enough people that view threats to their way of life or to their rights, and they start trying to elicit change through being active and trying to influence their representatives, change happens. And that's a part of democracy. Democracy isn't just an up or down vote of 50 people want this and 60 people want that, and so majority rules. If there's 20 people that really are passionate about this, they're going to fight tooth and nail for it and try to influence opinion and try to make the changes in their favor. It's a big deal.
But I've got to say, bringing it back, I mean, that was pretty much the case with the gun bill, and a massive majority of people were well in favour. It did not go the right way. I mean, how would you explain that one?
Oh, I think that only affirms the power of of persuasion if you are passionate enough and view an issue as something that has to be fought for.
I
And
think it shows the power of lobbying, which again
well, yeah,
it brings me back to my quite large concern about that and how
it can also be the power of lobbying, both be it in through money or through a small minority of people trying to elicit change. Because take in mind that a lot of these NRA members and hardcore gun owners, I mean, they're donating a few $100s to the political action groups and things like that. But it's not actually that much money that they're donating in aggregate. The real power comes from their phone calls and from their letter writing campaigns and the fact that they write their congresspeople and say, if you vote this way, I am not going to vote for you, and neither are all my friends. I'm going to tell them that you are against gun rights and that we are not going to vote for you. That's a big deal. Whereas most people that may be voters, they may say, oh, there was a gun vote, question mark. Oh, okay. They voted this way, that way, whatever. Don't really care. And that's the power of it. And you're right that a small minority, be it in population or be it in money or influence, can influence things. And that's why you have to be very active and understanding of what all the different things are going on within government in order to understand what the issues are at play.
Yeah, and I think we'll just bring in one last point here, guys, before we finish up, because it's been a long podcast today. But I'm just going to bring it right up to date. Literally the last couple of days in London, where I live, and basically people will have seen on the news there was an incident here in Woolwich in London where a couple of guys, I haven't got their names to hand, a couple of guys seemingly of extremist Islamist sort of belief, committed a crime against a British soldier who wasn't on duty, and basically killed him outright in the street in broad daylight. And we'll put a link to the BBC story about this. And, it kind of got me thinking today that it was a brutal attack. They literally just, I think they hit him with a car and then basically cut him, killed him in the street with knives, all manner of knives. And then these guys were shouting their propaganda. An interesting point, British armed police there shot two of them, and those guys they survived though. They're in hospital, and obviously they're going to be fully charged, with the law. But it got me onto thinking, kind of interestingly, that in this situation that happened, there were a couple of members of the British public who confronted these guys. One of them was a mother; she was a scout leader, and there's a couple of other people there who were comforting. Or the guy, I don't think the man obviously didn't survive, but they were there comforting him. But it got me kind of just thinking in general, because of the severity of this incident, it made me suddenly think, if you're a member of the public there and there's these people who are prepared to be this violent in this kind of situation, now obviously you have police to deal with, and the fact that it happened in London meant that the police are very heavy in London all over the place, so it wouldn't have been particularly long for them to arrive at the scene. However, I do remember, now I have to say I don't agree, and what we're talking about here is concealed carry. Now, personally, the concept of concealed carry scares the crap out of me. The idea that just any random person could be carrying a weapon around you and you wouldn't even know, I find that terrifying, and as a British person, I just cannot understand or get my head around it. However, and I know Daskro has a concealed carry license, so I say this, quite happily, but from my point of view, I just find it an interesting one to think of the sort of how would these situations have differed if people were allowed to conceal carry in the UK. It's not something I would want or advocate, but I do think it's an interesting idea to sort of think about. And it's something that people that in the US have concealed carry, it's the reason why they have it. That if a situation exactly like this were to happen, they're able to perhaps protect not just themselves, but other people. Daskro, what's your kind of perspective on this? And I say, I'm kind of mentioning the idea of what if it happened in the UK? But actually, I think it's more just kind of interesting to think of the idea of the reasons why people choose to conceal carry. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? And I say perhaps related specifically to this situation, how it could perhaps have panned out differently?
Sure. I don't think that concealed carry would have had much of a difference in this, only in that it may have ended in more aggression by the bystanders, maybe.
I
But
mean,
then again,
let me just ask one point, actually. I'll ask you a question, because I'm not clear on the specifics here. You have a concealed carry license. If, obviously if somebody's coming to attack you, very obviously, then you could use your weapon in self-defense. If you saw in this situation that we've seen in the news, if you saw a couple of guys attacking a man in this way, would you be able to use reasonable force to prevent them from committing that crime against that person? Would that be within the realm of law and rights in the US anyway? I don't know. Obviously, we don't have those laws in the UK, so I can't compare it. But if that exact situation happened in the US, would you be able to do anything to get involved and not be liable for it?
So the short answer is you would be liable for it, because unless it is a direct threat to you or your family, or in some states your property, there is no obligation for you to act in the defense of the common good. Yeah. And actually, a lot of states have laws in place where it is stacked against you if you were to make that decision in terms of liability and legal repercussions. In fact, most concealed carry training courses teach just the opposite. They basically say, if you are concealed carrying and you are in a situation where you perceive a threat, not that there is a threat, you need to walk away. You need to get out of that situation. You need to retreat. You need it, because concealed carry and having a gun on your person is not like a power ring with Green Lantern. It's not like that. It's not this you put this thing on, or you put this thing on your waist, and you suddenly can fight evil. It doesn't work that way. It's a tool like anything else, and you shouldn't be trying to play a hero. And the concealed carry classes that I've gone to have all emphasized that there's no dishonor in retreating. There's no cowardice in it trying to get away, even if there's some punk who says something really mean to you, or says something that disrespects you or your wife or your family. It's not worth taking a life over, be it potentially losing the life of you or your family members, or taking someone else's life. And that's a philosophical thing that a lot of people don't fully appreciate, and it's a mindset change. And I know when I started concealed carrying, I had to go to that mindset change, because a lot of people, their first instinct is, oh, someone just called me an asshole. Well, I'm going to get in their face, and it's a whole different situation. And going back to your the example in London, though, it's difficult to say. I mean, because
this is what I was going to say to you. This is what I was going to say to you was, me personally, if very, very sort of theoretical, if we had those laws in the UK, if I made the decision to own, which probably wouldn't, but if I was in that situation myself, when you think of an emotion of a situation like that, if you saw someone being attacked in a brutal way, could you not refrain yourself? I mean, could you stand by it and just go, well, I'm going to be liable for this? It's another person. They're being killed in front of you. Could you restrain yourself from not getting involved if you knew you had the kind of ability to do so? I don't know. Could you? Would you make that call?
There are situations in which where something like this has happened. So, for instance, there was a mall shooting, also in Colorado? No, or was it Washington State? There was a mall shooting about 7-8 months ago where there was a random shooter who was shooting a bunch of people, and there was a concealed carry holder, and he drew his gun and drew on the guy, and the perpetrator retreated and ended up killing himself. And but the guy,
but he didn't actually fire the guy.
He didn't fire because he viewed it as he didn't feel like he had a shot. He didn't feel like that he could take the shot, and he didn't feel like that, again, because he doesn't want to. One of the things that they drill into you when you sort of get into shooting and get into concealed carry and things like that is not only do you need to understand what you're shooting at, but you have to understand what is behind what you're shooting at.
Yeah.
And if there's people there, you may injure people, and that's a terrible thing to do.
Yeah.
And so, but the point is that there are situations where you can try to stop the situation, maybe draw on someone. But even then, there are schools of thought that say if you are in a position where you need to draw on someone, that means that you are in a position, by definition, in which you are a threat, where there is a threat to your life or to your loved ones or your property. And if that's not the case, then you're brandishing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And brandishing is against the law. But in the case of this London incident, even, I mean, the victim here was a soldier. Even if he was carrying a rifle,
yeah,
that rifle's not going to stop a car from hitting him.
No, that's true.
I mean, and that's the thing. It's not a power ring. Just because you got a weapon doesn't mean you're going to stop anything.
Yeah,
just because I have a weapon doesn't mean that I can stop 20 people going after me, an unruly crowd or whatever it may be. I mean,
I don't know. I just don't feel inclined. Like, it doesn't. I don't know whether it's just because I've grown up in the UK, so therefore I don't have the kind of mentality. And as we've spoken before, that's a kind of cultural thing, where, you know, it's just a totally different country. It's just a totally different situation.
Sure.
But for myself, I don't know. I just don't feel. I wouldn't feel concerned. And I say, you know, for people to say, oh, well, Luetin, that's because you live in the UK. I have travelled to places around the world. I have been in countries which are not always, you know, considered to be the safest situation. And I've been in certain areas of certain countries which are not the most safest situation. But in all those places, I still didn't feel like, oh, my God, if only I had a gun. I just felt like, hey, you know, with my sensibility and my kind of knowledge of people and the area that I'm sort of traveling to, I should be able to keep myself safe. And if any kind of random situation just happens, well, that's just life and that's just the way it goes. That's my perspective really on it. That, you know, when you live in a big city or wherever you live, wherever you're traveling to, whatever country you live in, wherever you want to go to, whether it's a safe or maybe a not so safe place, sometimes things are just going to happen. Sometimes bad things are just going to happen, and there isn't much you could do about it. Now, I guess people would say, well, you know, if you had a weapon, you're going to sort of reduce the chances of something bad happening to you, potentially, or it also has the potential to actually exacerbate that situation and make it considerably worse. And I think that's often been spoken about a lot, that often people carrying weapons, and I know in London, for example, we don't have a big gun problem, but we've mentioned before about how we have a big knife problem in London. And a lot of the time, the message that they try to give out to young people in London is that if you carry a knife in London, you are, you know, a hell of a lot more likely to actually end up in a bad situation. Because if people sort of feel like, hey, if I get this out, I'm able to protect myself. No, most often what's going to happen is by showing that you have a weapon, people are going to assume you're willing to use it, and you're actually more likely to end up in a deadly situation rather than just an argumentative situation. And I think that's a pretty important point to make. But sorry, were you going to ask me a question that I did not answer there?
No, I wasn't. But that's all right. I mean, it's a very valid point, and it's one that brings into the fold of these are simply tools, and tools can be used in the right way and the wrong way, and throwing any kind of tool in an environment in which people are using them incorrectly, or alternatively don't have proper training, or have a cultural disposition to on violence generally that isn't as humane, then you may have incidents that are not positive. I mean, that's very reasonable, and that's something that you know, we can see across many cultures and many areas in time, and it's something that is varied, to say the least. You know, in the end, philosophically, I believe in the right to self-defense, and believe the Second Amendment is a core element to that natural right. So that and you can take that to a lot of extremes. I understand, and at least in the United States, there is a cultural aspect to it as well. And clearly, there are certain social compromises that do have to take place there. And that's but that is the nature of all rights in one respect or another.
I agree, and you know, I think like we've said before, and like I've said recently, I think that what needs to happen in the US is people need to stop trying to have these knee-jerk, fast solutions, these kind of quick fix solutions where they go, right, we'll do this and it'll be sorted. It's just, that won't happen. If people actually want to make a genuine impact on how things change, and you're not going to see anything happen overnight, you're not going to see anything happen in 1 year or 2 years, it's going to take probably a generation to make any kind of significant difference. But people are not going to get anywhere by constantly trying to push through unrealistic expectations of, let's remove weapons or let's put in really severe restrictions on people, etc., etc. You can imagine that would solve the problem very quickly. But realistically, that will never get put into place. So therefore, you need to look at other issues, which comes back to my points about social issues, mental health issues, and general responsibility. And I believe that within responsibility, you could look at the way that people maintain and keep their weapons in their home. And, as I say, the thing is, from my point of view, I don't personally feel the need to own weapons, nor would I necessarily advocate a country sort of containing so many weapons. I feel in the UK right now it's very reasonable. I think people, if they really want to do hunting and shooting, they can do that. I mean, in the UK we have sort of hunting, shooting magazines even, that show loads of guns and stuff like this, all the different stuff that's coming out this year and the models and all this. So it's not something that is totally alien over here in the UK. It's just that the way in which people live and feel the need to actually have these things is very, very different. And as I say, that's why I say my general point that I've made from the very beginning when we started talking about this is that it is a cultural thing. And that's what people need to understand, is that, the US has had a long history of weapon ownership, and it's written into their constitution, into their rights. It's not something that you can just wave a magic wand and everything will be better. It's going to take a long time of people starting to understand, hey, we can't make a massive change here, but what we can do is start to make sort of some gradual changes towards people actually understanding the things that they need to do to try and help reduce the kind of terrible tragedies and just the general accidents that come as a result of this. And I use the word accidents, like Daskro said, weapons in many respects are a tool. They are a tool that can unfortunately be deadly, but no more so perhaps than other vehicles and so on. Cars, things like this. And I think that whole kind of aspect of just being responsible and perhaps, depending on which way you want to go with it, sort of perhaps having more regulation, not saying that you can't own things, but just saying that, if you want to own certain things, we need a little bit more regulation there in terms of your competency. I think that would personally go a long way towards sort of solving some of these problems in an element anyway, but long term I really believe that it's a social issue. It needs to come back to people putting pressure on other people to be more responsible, and actually just a very slow cultural change of saying, hey, there was a time for this, but it's not really an acceptable thing anymore, and because of all the things that we're seeing, we need to make some changes. I think it's something that will happen as a kind of more of a drip, where people over time start to go, actually I think we need to move more in kind of this direction than this direction, but I don't think we're going to see any kind of blanket change where suddenly, a hammer drops and says, that's it. That's never going to happen. I think people need to kind of get their feet on the ground before things actually start moving in the right direction. Okay, guys, so we're going to wrap it up here at the end. A long podcast. I hope you've enjoyed. Thank Daskro for joining me today, and we had another good discussion. As always, it's obviously a heated topic. A lot of people have some very strong opinions about all these issues. So try to be respectful about other people's opinions, but we both look forward to reading your opinions, and we'll get back to you in the comment section as always in my videos. So thanks for watching, guys. That's all it from me today.
And remember, guys, just keep it civil. Luke and I have very different opinions about this number of other issues, and yet we're able to have this very easygoing discourse. You guys can do the same in the comments below. So thanks for tuning in. See you guys later.